Welcome to the first of a two-part review of the Fractal Design Meshify 2 Mini. In this part we'll be covering the specs, full build, and a detailed overview of everything as usual. Then part 2 coming soon, or in the cards if it's uploaded now, we'll cover the thermal and acoustic performance in line with my standardized testing, and we'll go over a range of different fan setups you might want to try in this case to work out what works best. Before I get into everything, I just want to take a moment to say, if you're searching for a case and you're getting invested in the latest case trends, FOMO if you will, take a step back and understand that the latest hot off the press cases aren't all that special, and there will be a never-ending amount of new cases. Cases have been of high quality with good feature sets for quite a few years now, so find one that works for you. And don't get too hung up on keeping on top of the new cycle. Just figure out if you want a new case for the right reasons, then take a step in the right direction for you. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started with part 1, the overview. The unboxing process was much the same as most others, only they're being extra careful around the front panel with a sheet of closed-cell foam. Maybe they've had a few too many returns for their liking on previous Meshify panels, or maybe panels in general, and the price of foam outweighs the return cost of a $110 or so case. Now, I'm not a contrast aficionado, but there's something off about this lightish blue on dull brown packaging texture stuff, and it's messing with my eyes. They did something similar on the Torrent series of cases, but in black, and that worked fine. Frankly, they don't need to do anything here. It's a waste of ink. I'm not impressed. I'm not sure if many people are. They could leave it blank, but to save face on their not being sub-premium, they could print a small note along the lines of "plain to save the planet," or something like that. Then use the saved money to do an office party or something for all the hardworking people designing and making these cases. Anyway, getting the basics down, the Meshify 2 Mini is a micro ATX case. There are a number of variants to cover your ITX, micro ATX, ATX, big ATX, and really big eATX needs, each having a different amount of SKUs, the Mini here having a white body with black front and clear glass, and the other SKU being an all-black chassis with a tinted glass panel. Just backtracking for a second, Mini is for micro ATX and Nano is for Mini ITX. Anyway, other than the front panel that's not exactly unique at this point, there's nothing standout about the exterior. The other side panel is all steel, clear of impressions, which is a clean look. The rear is a standard layout with a lower power supply unit position beneath a basement shroud. We have a central PCI Express slot section with strong side ventilation, good for your GPU, and up top is the motherboard rear I/O position with a fan position adjacent populated by a 1200 RPM 120mm 3-pin fan. Up top we have a vastly steel perforated panel that's inset into the main top panel. I'd expect it to be steel at this price range instead of plastic, so that's good. The I/O up top consists of a couple of Type A 3.0 ports, a reset and power button, a Type C port, and individual mic and headphone jacks. And here are the motherboard connectors for all of them. One note on the buttons. As buttons go, and criticisms for that, they're pretty low quality. It's not a big deal, they just feel and sound like buttons a quarter the price of this case. Just listen to the power button. Sounds very cheap. Last stop before we break this thing open is the base. Nothing to complain about here. We've got a full basement filter that's removable from the front, which frees up access to the drive cage screws for different placement, and there's a set of 4 feet with rubber pads that act as some of the filter's guides. So let's get in this thing and start a build. I've got a lot to discuss on this new panel removal mechanism. Side note, it's impressive how many different panel removal mechanisms there are. How long does it take to find the optimal panel removal mechanism, one that satisfies both manufacturing and the end user? Doing it a long time, it seems to change and doesn't really get much better. Anyway, I think there's a lot of tolerance that could change the experience of this new mechanism from case to case, so I'll preface this section by saying my experience may be different to other owners, so anyone going hardcore keyboard warrior in the comments is a fool and didn't listen to this part of the video. People be weird about criticism, so with that out of the way, here's the deal. The side panels have no screws to be removed before they can be removed from the case. Instead, there's just a tab up top of each of the panels to the back of the case. Just looking at the case, it's not entirely clear how it's supposed to work. Does it slot up or down to unlock? Is it locked in place first? Just playing around with it doesn't seem to answer the questions. But you do have access to the manual without removing the panels, where you'll find it's a straight pull that removes them. But man, these are tough cookies. You don't have a lot of purchase on these tabs, especially since they're curved with a very shallow gradient, which works great for buttons you press on, but not for tabs that you need to pull on. And the posts and sockets are relatively secure, which they kind of have to be since there's no optional locking screws like there were with the Torrent series of cases. So those sloped tabs and the strong posts means you might have a hard time removing the panels. On top of that, there's not a lot of flat area to press against to pull the tab thanks to the beveled edge to the top of the case. So anyone who hails from the thick-thumbed lineage might struggle to avoid pressing against the glass, counteracting your efforts to remove the panel. Now, I had a really tough time removing the glass panel, but not so much with the steel side panel, which shows how wide the tolerance can be just on the same case. It's worth stating that these will get slightly easier to work with over time since the plastic slots will weaken, and I have noticed that, not so much with the glass panel, but the steel side panel especially. Bottom line, if, then big if, big emphasis on that if, getting inside your case regularly with ease is the most important thing to you, and the most important thing to you, big if, then maybe this isn't your next case. Onto the top panel, it's a lift situation, and it's fine, but again, there's the beveled or sloped grip, and like the side panels, it feels designed for people with very slim, nimble fingers, or also very strong, nimble, slim fingers. I can't remove the top panel unless I've removed at least one of the side panels to get enough grip to push it off or lift it from the side to gradually disengage the posts. Again, something that could reduce in strength over time, so and tolerance may vary, so you might not experience the same thing. There are also 6 posts in total, which I'm sure is pretty good for rigidity, but dense ease of use. I'd remove the center 2 if I use this long term, and they seem simple enough to remove and pop out, so not so bad. Underneath the top panel is a fine mesh filter, and considering the top panel itself is a perforated panel, this is belt and braces for filtration, which will have an impact on performance to some degree. Great for dust, but maybe not so much for thermals if you're throwing a radiator up top here. But you do have the option of removing the inner filter to knock the temperature and or noise down a touch, which is great. And last but not least, the front panel, and this one is just good all round, for the most part. The lower filter is fairly easy to remove from the front, which then uncovers a lower handle to the front panel. This is the only well-sized grip on any of these panels of this case, and is definitely needed since they've opted to use the much more basic post and hole clip than the top panel and the side panels, so it does need some rough handling to override. Replacing this panel is quite awkward in my experience, at least when the top panel is in place. There's a clip to the top that needs to be slotted in place to allow the top panel to be clipped into the chassis easily. The top clip can be completely bypassed when the top panel isn't in place, since it's slotting into a plastic bracket which will bend out of the way, but when the top panel is in place, the assembly is much more solid, which requires much more brute force or a little finagling. I don't think it's necessary, since this is the first case I've seen with this kind of mechanism being used, including all of Fractal Design's cases. Normally this traditional hole and slot post thing does a good job itself. There's even aligning notches in the whole mechanism, so I don't understand why they need it. It's not necessary, just bin it. There's more to the front panel than what's on the surface. For a start, the perforated steel panel has posts and sockets to one side and socketed hinges to the other, which allow it to act as a door. I couldn't tell you why it has a hinge, since you can't remove the inner filter when it's in the open position. You have to remove the inner panel entirely to get that out. I guess it's just a fancier and more controlled way of removing the front panel, but they could have made that inner filter more accessible without removing the whole panel from its hinges, and that would have made it much more awesome. it's just kind of weird at this point. Speaking of which, removing the filter from the front panel it's a little tricky. There's a fair amount of friction in the system, and again, the small tabs to the top and bottom provide very little purchase to remove it. On a side note, I know I've experienced better ways of doing this, and I know Fractal Design have better ways of doing this as well, which makes it puzzling as to why this system exists. Like I said earlier, there are so many different mechanisms and variations of the same mechanism. It's strange how they're still being iterated upon and seem to be getting worse. Maybe I've got one of the units that has the worst tolerances for this mechanism and the others, but it's not great all things considered. And as far as my opinion goes in a video, like a review, this is my experience and I can only comment on what I'm experiencing. Alright, now we're properly in, let's take a good look around the chassis and get a build going, starting with the fan and radiator options. Fan and radiator support is actually above average for a case of this size, at least according to my big spreadsheet of cases. Up front, you can go up to a 240 or 280mm radiator, and up to 3 120 or 2 140mm fans. There's a fair amount of depth variation depending on the position of the drive cage, which you can check out on the screen now. Over there, I think. Up top, there's space for a 240mm radiator or a couple of 120 or 140mm fans. To the rear, you've got room for a 120mm fan and or radiator. And rather surprisingly, there's room for a 120mm fan and or radiator in the basement. I don't think I'm alone in wanting to water cool a case that has a hidden basement radiator. I'm thinking a radiator with a fan and then like a pump res combo towering out of the basement. That would be nice. Alright, let's move on from fantasy into reality. Starting with the power supply and install, Fractal have opted to go for the bracket and slot approach. So the bracket comes off the back of the case, is attached to an ATX power supply in it with the included screws, and then the whole assembly is slotted through the back of the case and secured in place with the retained thumb screws. This is one of the most user-friendly approaches to install a power supply unit that there is. We've even got some rubber pads for the power supply unit to sit on, and there's even some ventilation in the basement shroud for fan side up installation, so it's top marks all round. In terms of length clearance available, the stats are on the screen now to the right. With the drive cage far to the front, you could go for up to a 180mm power supply unit if you enjoy the feeling of irritation. But I'd give yourself a fighting chance and max out at 170mm. Far back, it's tough to say what you should go for, since my rule of thumb is to give yourself around 30mm of space for the cables to make the turn out of the power supply unit, and give yourself some space to fold up excess cables, which with the drive cage to the back would give you 115mm of space, which is too small for an ATX power supply unit. So you could adapt down to a 100mm deep SFX power supply unit, but then you're heading towards extra noise from the smaller unit, so yeah. Best I can say is if you really want a 240 or 280mm radiator in the front, and it's going to block up some of that lower section, unfortunately, that will force the drive cage back, assuming you're keeping the drive cage. I'd limit the radiator to 40mm thick maximum, which is a good size radiator, so with some standard 25mm thick fans, you'll only have to move the drive cage back 65mm, which gives you around 160mm to play with in the rear, and there are a good smattering of 130mm power supply units on the market to make that work for you. Or go with a 30mm thick radiator, and then that opens up the power supply unit space tons with a load 140mm option, so the world's your oyster at that point. Onto the motherboard, and there's really not a lot to say here. Although I will. There's a standoff post to the center that makes alignment easier, there are plenty of cable management options above the motherboard position, and since there's top radiator compatibility and a very open mounting design, the CPU or EPS cable hookup is easier than ever, which heals some of the wounds of my fat-thumbed brethren after the battle of panel removal from recent memory. Not so much cable management support to the base though, and the HD audio cable is on the shorter side, which hurts a tidy cable management job a touch. Good overall though. CPU cooler support is strong at 167mm. That covers the vast majority of the market, including the excellent 155mm tall Scythe Mugen 5 here. Now onto drives. Let's cover the simple bit first. There are two 2.5-inch drive trays to the back of the motherboard tray. You can attach drives to them with screws, slot them to the back of the motherboard tray, and secure them with the retained thumb screws. The slotting part is kind of awkward since you can't really see the notch and the slot. It's a bit of blind corner there, but it's fine, so let's not get too testy. You can also place them on the top of the basement shroud, but this will have a slight blocking effect on the lowest PCI Express slot. You can also place a single drive on the back of the motherboard tray, sideways, if you're a psychopath. That's the easier part out of the way. Now for the 3.5-inch drive cage. Kind of a lie there. Once it's been removed, you can slot a 2.5-inch drive on top, bringing us to a total of 3. But back to the removal part. There are two suggestions in the manual. One is through the rear, so once you've removed the screws securing it to the same slots used for fan or radiators at the base, you can then remove the power supply unit bracket and make an exit to the rear pronto. Not so fast if you've got a power supply unit in the way, but it's an option if you're just starting your build. Or you can lift the drive cage from the top after removing the two plastic panels. I've got a love-hate relationship with these panels. I love their existence, that they're well color matched and texture matched to the steel, and that they're split into two sections to give you options on the depth of your cooling configuration and keep things a bit tidier. However, they are horrendously designed to be removed. Underneath each of the slits in the top is a notch that's meshing with the chassis. So to remove the panel, these need bending, which disengages the notch of the panel with the slot of the chassis. Simple in theory, but executed like an executioner with a plastic axe. It will get through eventually, but it's not going to be clean, and you're probably going to need to get some extra tools. And it's probably just going to be easier to bend the target than use what you're given. Like the analogy, they need work, but they need a lot of work. I wanted to find a way how to adequately show how unforgiving these plastic relief slots are, so I pressed them with my fingers, then with a plastic prying tool with significant force, then press it with another prying tool that's designed to have some give to bend. Note that there's very little give in the panel compared to the tool. And then I thought I'd top it off with a metal prying tool, and there's more give in it than the plastic that's supposed to bend out of the way. Don't go looking to the notches on the other side of the panel to help you out. They're twice as deep and they have no give at all. I actually tried using the prying tool, which I have used to disassemble laptops and phones, and laptops have very similar mechanisms to these. These are terrible. So I tried to use that to remove the panels when they were installed, and it was barely any better than using my nails, and I'd rather sacrifice the tool than my nails. But it's just easier to circumvent the intended way by flexing and bending the panels as a whole out of the slots. Again, great concept, but really bad execution. But I'd rather have it here like this than not at all. And just to clarify, any keyboard warriors out there, I have used relief slots like this on many different things. I think we all have, and I'm very justified in saying that this one's awful. Anyway, with them out of the way, the cage can be removed from the top. There's a curve in the top of the cage just to avoid a clash with an installed board, which is just an excellent forethought from the designers. It makes me believe that they did test this design at least a little before production commenced. That feeling isn't always present with a lot of case designs. As for installing 3.5-inch drives to this, they fix to the sleds with grommets and screws, and the sleds return to the cage and are screwed with a retained thumb screw from the front. We've already covered the clearances impacted by the drive cage, but they're on the screen now to the right side for the power supply unit and the cooling clearance. Pause at your leisure. The graphics card install was very standard. I still want to draw attention though to the incessant use of thumb screws for PCI Express slots. They can be removed by hand, but replacing them certainly requires a tool, when there's a card in the way especially, and that being the case, heavy thumb screws, even on a half-decent magnetic screwdriver, will tend to fall off if your screwdriver is not on dead-on alignment. And if they don't fall off, they'll be, more prone to sort of flopping out of the way. And since there's no cutout in the chassis to accommodate a tool, you're always slightly out of alignment on approach with this case. A standard screw, like those used for the power supply unit, with the same threading, are much lighter and less likely to fall off if you're not dead on alignment. These should just be the standard, since there's no use for thumb screws when you need to use a tool anyway and you can't hand fasten them. Anyway, rant over. Let's move on to cable management. There's not a huge amount to add that I haven't covered already. There's a decent spread of cable management holes with grommets all round, apart from beneath the motherboard, and as mentioned earlier, the HD audio cable it's too short for this case, so it had to be run across the drive slot area, which doesn't match the same attention and style this case has been designed under everywhere else. The depth or space behind the motherboard tray is good and caused no problems for me, and the way the side panels are replaced definitely helps this. Since they're hinged back into position, they can pick up any of the slack of any of the cables that are poking out of place. There are a liberal smattering of Velcro straps all round, which is excellent, but I don't think enough care and attention went into the guidance of the cables up the formed cable shaft. There's not that much space in front of the 3.5-inch drives for all the cables to traverse through and hook up to the two 3.5-inch drives and a 2.5-inch drive up top, as well as deal with all the excess cables. I mean, I haven't even got SATA cables in here as well. That would be a nightmare. If you had custom length cables with very little excess, it could work fine, but standard cables might be problematic if you're looking to pack the whole case full of drives, a card or two, a radiator up front, and the largest power supply that you can get. I just think you're going to run out of cable management space. Best case, you'd have to just press the leftover cables up the back and against the motherboard tray and the back of the motherboard. Worst case, you'll overstretch the case and get frustrated and have to sacrifice a 3.5-inch drive to slot to just store all the excess cables. Long story short, I think of this case as having many options, and leaning into one may negate the ability to choose others. This section of the review is dedicated to lighting, and this case does have some lighting. It's a small diffusing strip that's backed by some LEDs. It's not controllable, and the light barely makes it through the 2 layers of filters, but it exists, and now you know. As for the manual and parts box, you can find the manual in the main box with the case when you open it up, and the parts box sits in one of the drive sleds inside the case. You get all the screws you need in the parts box and some zip ties as well as a cloth to wipe your... I think they've done a good enough job with the amount of included Velcro straps in the case to not feel the need to include a pile of zip ties that will mostly end up in landfill. I've never used a zip tie in any of my builds, I just use Velcro straps, and they've included so many that I don't feel the need to use any of my own. Let's move away from disposable stuff and press forward with reusable stuff. Straps are the way to a better future. As for the manual, it's pretty good all round, but I still hate the build example pages as they don't correctly address the limits of the case in comparison to their examples. If you're new to these manuals from Fractal, the numbers up top are a reflection of the blue components in the graphic below. Unfortunately, they don't include all of the components in the graphic up top in the text, and the GPU model in the graphic either isn't to scale or the text is just wrong. To illustrate, I will flip back and forth between the water cooling and air cooling examples, and you'll notice that the graphics card graphic is the same, and there's a good amount of space between it and the fans to the front on both examples. But in the water cooling example, it says in the text that it's filling the entire possible 267mm of space, whereas there's 306mm of space in the air cooling build example, but the distance between the GPU and fans is the same as the other water cooling example. The graphics just don't replicate what they're saying. For people who can read between the lines, this part of the review is just infuriating, as it's just obvious. But for many new builders, the lack of consistency will just be confusing. I implore Fractal Design to either make the graphics reflect the text above and include power supply unit length, since that's a critical factor in the layout of a system, especially relating to water-cooled builds, since it will have an impact on the 3.5-inch drive position, and maybe just add some dimensions on the graphics. They have added in brackets up top with up to information, which is something that I and probably many others complained about before, which is a great move, a great addition from the previous ones they've done. But they're not out of the woods and need to keep going for these to make these flawless as they should be. This is something you're paying for after all. Why not receive a flawless version of the easiest part of the case, the manual? So let's get into a conclusion of sorts and wrap up this overview. We'll cover the performance in the next video, which will wrap up all the scores to get a final score. Specification relative to its volume and the market, it's sitting at 4.5 out of 10, which it sounds bad, but it's only just below average of 5, so it's fine, but nothing special. Now, that takes into account the size of each of the components relative to the volume of the case, and is then ranked against roughly 300 cases on the market, or previously on the market. On raw specification, this case is actually the best on the list, but part of my specification score includes a bonus score for included fans that's based on size, amount, and overall quality. And since there are other cases with more and larger fans on the list, this case gets a total combined specification score of 6.6. Whereas something like the Torrent Compact gets 6.1 for its fan score, taking it to a total of 9.6 thanks to its many massive high quality included fans. Build quality wise, the Meshify 2 Mini gets a 7.3 out of 10, which is relatively very good. Only letdowns to me were the panel flex being a little higher than it could be, so it got a middle of the road 5 for that, and likewise the glass panel is 3mm thick, which is very average, so it gets another 5. Remember, 3mm is average and 5 is right in the middle, so it's okay. No need to get angry about a 5. The 2.5-inch drive sleds were also very average, so another 5 there, but the chassis flex was great and the filter options are excellent, so there's a couple of 10s to make up for the average scores. As for installation ease, this is by far the Meshify 2 Mini's strongest accomplishment, coming in at 9.3 out of 10. Minus the panel access, at least in its early days of ownership, it's scoring 10s in packaging, motherboard installation, CPU cooler access, and drive installation, and 9s in filter access, graphics card installation, and cable management. We'll get into the final scores in the upcoming performance part of the review, but something we can cover is the price relative to other cases. And unfortunately, this case isn't cheap, so it's going to have to score well in its performance to stand out from the larger cases, but it shouldn't take much to perform better than the Fractal Design Pop Mini Silent, since that thing was out of control thermally. Very hot case. Now for the begging. If you want to pick this one up, give the Amazon links in the video description a click. They're affiliate links, so it will support me at no extra cost to you, and every once in a while I get money from Amazon that helps me upgrade things like the lights. And I'm really looking for a wide-angle fast lens, so there's more separation between the foreground, myself and the case, and the background over there. Fast lenses, they're just... they work their magic in small, tight spaces. Anyways, I hope this video covered everything you could want to know about the design of the Meshify 2 Mini. Stay tuned for the performance review, final scores, and the conclusion in part 2. If I managed to cover everything you were looking for, please consider giving the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more like this. It's a real help for the channel in a big picture way, and yeah, any support I can get, greatly appreciated. If this one blew you away, perhaps think about supporting me on Patreon. Every little helps, and every month, or maybe so, typically speaking, I'll post an update with everything that's happened since the last update, so you always know what's happened and what's going to happen on the channel, and just general thoughts and ideas from me. If you want more videos from me, they're over there. Hopefully there's ones you're liking. Otherwise, thanks for checking this one out, and I'll catch you in the next one.